They locked the archives, changed the translations, buried gods that didn't fit doctrine. Ancient tablets describe beings older than Christianity, powerful genetic engineers, sky rulers. If the Anunnaki threatened the church's origin story, erasing them meant controlling humanity's past and deciding who humanity was allowed to worship and what truth survived. Before doctrine, there were tablets. Long before Christian institutions existed, records from southern Mesopotamia described a group of deities known as the Anunna, or Anunnaki. These names appear in cuneiform texts recovered from sites such as Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu. The earliest surviving references date to the late 3rd millennium BCE, during the Sumerian and early Akkadian periods. The tablets were administrative, liturgical, and legal in nature, written by temple scribes trained within formal schools. In these texts, the Anunnaki are not presented as a mystery, but as a defined category within a wider divine order, associated with authority, judgment, and the regulation of cities. When these tablets were first excavated in the 19th century, they entered a Europe already shaped by centuries of theological interpretation. Between the 1840s and the early 1900s, thousands of clay fragments were transported to institutions such as the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. Smaller collections entered university archives and private holdings. Early translators, including Henry Rawlinson, George Smith, and later Leonard William King, focused on linguistic reconstruction rather than theological comparison. Their published translations appeared in academic journals and museum bulletins, often circulated in limited print runs. During the same period, the Vatican maintained its own scholarly infrastructure. The Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana, formally reorganized in the 15th century, expanded steadily through acquisitions, donations, and diplomatic exchanges. Its holdings included manuscripts in Latin, Greek, Syriac, Hebrew, Arabic, and Ethiopic. By the 19th century, Vatican scholars followed developments in Assyriology through correspondence with European academics. Letters preserved in the archives reference Mesopotamian discoveries in general terms, noting their relevance to Near Eastern chronology and language studies rather than doctrine. The Anunnaki appear in Sumerian compositions, such as the Kesh Temple Hymn, the Code of Ur-Nammu, and fragments of the so-called Eridu Genesis. In these sources, they are described collectively rather than individually, often in formulaic phrases. They sit in council, assign functions, and witness oaths. The language is procedural and ceremonial. No single narrative dominates. Modern translations differ slightly in phrasing, but the structural role remains consistent across texts recovered from different cities and periods. By the early 20th century, Catholic biblical scholars were engaged in reassessing the historical context of the Old Testament. Institutions like the Pontifical Biblical Institute, founded in 1909, trained priests in Semitic languages, including Akkadian. Course catalogues from the 1920s list cuneiform as an auxiliary subject. Internal memoranda emphasized philological precision and caution in comparative work. References to Mesopotamian deities were treated as part of a broader ancient Near Eastern environment, not as parallel belief systems requiring reconciliation. Access to certain Vatican materials has always been regulated. The Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive in 2019, historically restricted entry to credentialed researchers. These restrictions applied uniformly, regardless of topic. Requests were evaluated based on institutional affiliation and stated research purpose. Scholars studying Assyriology rarely applied for access, as primary cuneiform sources were housed elsewhere. The Vatican did not possess original Anunnaki tablets, only secondary literature and correspondence. Public discussion about suppression often traces back to the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, first formalized in 1559 and abolished in 1966. The index listed works deemed doctrinally harmful, mostly theological or philosophical. No Assyriological publications were formally placed on the index. Works by scholars such as Friedrich Delitzsch, who lectured on Babel and Bible in the early 1900s, were criticized publicly by church authorities, but not banned. The criticism focused on methodology and tone rather than on the existence of Mesopotamian gods. Translations of Anunnaki-related texts continued to circulate throughout the 20th century in academic contexts. Journals like Zeitschrift für Assyriologie and Journal of Cuneiform Studies published new readings and fragment joins. These articles were technical and narrowly focused. They attracted little attention outside specialist circles. The Vatican's own publications during this period concentrated on biblical archaeology in Palestine, Egypt, and Syria, with minimal reference to Sumerian cosmology. The language used in Mesopotamian tablets posed challenges for comparison. Terms translated as God, Lord, or Divine Assembly carried different connotations across cultures. Vatican scholars noted these linguistic limits in internal lectures and published commentaries. Caution was emphasized. Ancient categories were not to be mapped directly onto later theological frameworks. This approach mirrored that of secular historians and was consistent with broader academic standards of the time. Interest in the Anunnaki expanded beyond academia in the late 20th century, driven largely by popular books rather than new archaeological finds. These works often relied on selective translations and speculative synthesis. Vatican responses, when issued, took the form of general statements about responsible scholarship and the distinction between mythological literature and doctrinal texts. No official documents addressed the Anunnaki by name. Silence in this context aligned with institutional practice rather than an articulated policy. Within the Vatican Library today, catalogue records show holdings of Assyriological reference works, lexicons, and excavation reports, acquired through standard academic exchange. These materials are shelved alongside other ancient Near Eastern studies. Researchers who consult them do so under the same conditions as those studying unrelated subjects. The presence of these books reflects participation in scholarly discourse rather than endorsement or opposition. What remains observable is a pattern of distance. Mesopotamian texts describing the Anunnaki were studied, translated, and archived primarily outside ecclesiastical control. Vatican institutions acknowledged their existence within historical scholarship while maintaining a narrow focus on biblical tradition. The records show administrative caution, controlled access, and limited commentary. They do not record directives, edicts, or coordinated efforts concerning these ancient names, clay, kingship, and early translation. The earliest modern encounters with texts that mention the Anunnaki did not occur through intact stories or complete tablets. They began with fragments recovered from ruins whose original order had already been lost. In the middle decades of the 19th century, excavations led by Austin Henry Layard and later Hormuzd Rassam uncovered large quantities of clay tablets at sites including Nineveh, Nimrud, and Kuyunjik. Many of these tablets had been broken in antiquity by fire, collapse, or deliberate destruction. Others fractured during removal. What reached Europe were pieces of a much larger archive, separated from their architectural and ritual settings. These fragments were shipped in bulk to London, Paris, and Berlin. Early shipment lists recorded weight rather than content. In many cases, tablets from different rooms or buildings were mixed together. Context had to be reconstructed later through handwriting, vocabulary, and format. This process unfolded slowly. Some fragments remained uncatalogued for decades after their arrival in museum basements. Translation emerged from this environment of partial information. The first scholars capable of reading cuneiform were trained primarily in biblical languages. Akkadian was approached through comparison with Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. Sign lists were compiled gradually, with meanings inferred from repetition and parallel usage. Early translations reflected this uncertainty. Published editions from the 1870s and 1880s frequently presented several possible readings for a single line. In this early phase, the word Anunnaki did not stand out. It appeared as a plural noun in ritual lists, hymns, and legal formulas. Translators often left the term untranslated or rendered it generically as the gods. This choice reflected caution rather than interpretation. Without narrative context, there was little basis for elaboration. Footnotes sometimes noted alternative readings, but no attempt was made to define the group beyond its grammatical role. As Assyriology developed as a formal discipline, German scholars introduced stricter methods. By the late 19th century, figures such as Friedrich Delitzsch and Hugo Winkler emphasized internal consistency and historical layering within the texts. They noted that the term Anunna appeared in earlier Sumerian compositions, while Anunnaki became more common in later Akkadian contexts. This distinction was treated as linguistic rather than theological. The difference was explained through phonetic development and scribal convention. Royal inscriptions provided a consistent setting for these terms. In texts from the 3rd dynasty of Ur, dating to approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE, kings invoked the Anunnaki as witnesses to legal acts. Boundary stones, land grants, and law codes included fixed phrases calling upon divine assemblies to uphold decisions. Translators rendered these phrases using administrative language. The Anunnaki functioned as guarantors, not as actors. Their presence marked authority rather than narrative involvement. This pattern shaped how kingship language was understood. Sumerian rulers described themselves as chosen, established, or supported by divine groups. The phrasing followed formulaic patterns similar to those found in later legal traditions. There were no extended speeches or direct instructions attributed to the Anunnaki. Translators preserved this restraint. Verbs were rendered in passive or declarative forms. Agency remained with the king, while divine approval appeared as a condition rather than a directive. The Code of Hammurabi illustrates this transition. While earlier divine assemblies are referenced, the emphasis shifts towards specific gods such as Shamash. The Anunnaki appear briefly and without elaboration. Scholars noted this shift but treated it as part of a broader consolidation of divine authority in royal ideology. Translation reflected the text structure. The Anunnaki receded into background language, acknowledged but not emphasized. Publication practices reinforced this outcome. Early translations were designed for specialists. Pages were filled with transliterations, sign lists, and variant readings. Commentary focused on grammar and paleography. There was little space for synthesis. When popular summaries appeared, usually in museum guides or general histories, editors simplified terminology. Multiple divine categories were grouped together. The Anunnaki lost distinction through condensation rather than argument. Museum display choices further shaped public perception. In the early 20th century, institutions such as the British Museum organized galleries around themes of kingship, law, and empire. Tablets were displayed as artifacts of administration and governance. Labels mentioned rulers and cities but rarely explained divine names. The Anunnaki, when present, were subsumed under general headings like religious text or legal inscription. Linguistic detail was absent from the display space. During the interwar period, academic work slowed. Economic constraints limited funding for long-term projects. Many fragments remained unpublished, stored in drawers or crates. Scholars focused on completing dictionaries and grammars rather than producing new syntheses. References to the Anunnaki continued to appear in technical articles, usually as part of discussions about sign usage or textual variants. These mentions were brief and unelaborated. After the Second World War, Assyriology regained momentum. Large collaborative projects were launched, including the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. This work aimed to document Akkadian vocabulary comprehensively. Entries for Anunnaki listed occurrences across periods and genres. Each citation was presented without interpretation. The dictionary format imposed neutrality. Meaning was derived from usage, not from narrative reconstruction. Temple hymns and liturgical texts added further data. In compositions associated with the Ikur temple at Nippur, the Anunnaki appear as recipients of offerings during festivals. The language is repetitive and ceremonial. Translators noted the fixed structure of these passages. There was no variation that suggested individual characterization. Translation choices reflected this uniformity. Collective nouns were maintained. Descriptive adjectives were avoided. As biblical archaeology gained prominence, scholars began cautious comparisons. Divine councils in Mesopotamian texts were compared to similar motifs in Hebrew literature. These comparisons focused on literary structure rather than belief. The Anunnaki were cited as examples of a broader ancient Near Eastern convention. Translation avoided equivalence. Terms were kept culturally specific. This approach limited their relevance to theological debate. Throughout these developments, translation standards emerged through consensus rather than authority. Peer review, conference discussion, and revised editions shaped accepted readings. When disagreements arose, they were recorded openly. Alternative translations were published side by side. The Anunnaki did not become a focal point of controversy because their textual role remained limited. They appeared where the tablets placed them, without expansion. By the mid-20th century, most foundational translations were considered stable. New discoveries refined details but did not alter overall understanding. The Anunnaki remained associated with kingship, law, and ritual. Their presence was consistent but understated. Translation practices mirrored this consistency. The texts themselves offered little narrative elaboration, and translators did not supply it. The translation record reveals a gradual narrowing shaped by method. Early uncertainty gave way to technical precision. Words were assigned functions based on context. Speculation was avoided. The Anunnaki became part of an administrative and ritual framework preserved in clay. This outcome reflects how scholars worked, how texts were presented, and how institutions prioritized accuracy over synthesis. Archives without footnotes. By the beginning of the 20th century, the study of Mesopotamian texts had settled into a slow, regulated rhythm shaped by institutions rather than individuals. Clay tablets were no longer newly discovered curiosities. They had become archived objects, absorbed into bureaucratic systems designed to preserve, classify, and limit handling. Meaning moved through these systems cautiously. Interpretation followed access. And access followed rules that were rarely written down in full. Original tablets were concentrated in a small number of national museums and research centres. The British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and later the Oriental Institute in Chicago became primary custodians. Each institution developed its own internal cataloguing logic. Tablet numbers, excavation codes, and shelf locations replaced narrative descriptions. A tablet was known by a sequence of digits, not by what it described. Archives functioned as filters. Scholars could not browse freely. Requests had to be precise. A researcher did not ask to see religious texts or divine names. They requested a specific tablet number, often based on a reference in a previous publication. This practice favored continuity over discovery. What had already been cited was more likely to be seen again. What had not was easier to overlook. The Vatican Library operated within a parallel but distinct system. It did not house original Mesopotamian tablets. Its role was secondary, focused on scholarship rather than artifacts. Acquisition records from the late 19th century show steady accumulation of Assyriological journals, excavation reports, grammars, and dictionaries. These entered the collection through exchanges with European academies and universities. The materials were catalogued under language and region, without thematic emphasis. Access to Vatican holdings followed established protocols. Scholars applied for entry, presented credentials, and declared a research focus. Reading rooms were supervised. Materials were requested by call number. There is no evidence of subject-based restriction related to Mesopotamian religion. Works mentioning the Anunnaki were treated the same as any other academic text. They were neither highlighted nor concealed. University archives followed similar principles. Departments of Assyriology were small and specialized. Students were trained to work with fragments, not concepts. Coursework emphasized paleography, grammar, and historical chronology. Reading lists consisted of tablet editions and reference works. Divine names appeared as vocabulary items, not as subjects of inquiry. This training shaped scholarly habits that persisted into publication. Silence in academic writing often resulted from this specialization. Journals favored narrowly defined problems. Articles addressed the reading of a damaged sign, the reconstruction of a broken line, or the dating of a tablet based on handwriting style. Editors discouraged broad interpretation. Footnotes replaced narrative. Within this structure, repeated divine names attracted little attention unless they posed a linguistic difficulty. Correspondence between scholars reinforces this picture. Letters preserved in university archives discuss tablet joins, disagreements over readings, and delays in publication. They rarely address thematic meaning. When divine groups such as the Anunnaki are mentioned, it is usually in passing, as part of a technical clarification. The focus remains consistently procedural. Archival organization itself shaped what could be studied. Catalogues were often incomplete or inconsistent. Some tablets were indexed by genre, others by provenance, others by language. Divine names were not uniformly indexed. A researcher searching legal texts might encounter Anunnaki references, while one focused on hymns might not. The dispersion of references across genres and collections limited thematic synthesis. Periods of political upheaval intensified these constraints. The First World War disrupted travel and communication. Scholars were unable to visit collections. Notes remained unpublished. The Second World War caused direct damage to museums and archives. Emergency measures prioritized preservation. Tablets were packed, moved, or sealed. Research was suspended. When work resumed, the emphasis was on recovery and catalogue restoration, not reinterpretation. Post-war reforms introduced new technologies. Photography and microfilm allowed wider consultation. Scholars could study copies without travelling. Even so, access remained mediated. Requests still required justification. The emphasis remained technical. The Anunnaki continued to appear as part of the textual background. Within religious scholarship, similar patterns prevailed. Biblical scholars engaged with Mesopotamian material selectively. Comparative studies focused on law codes, flood narratives, and royal ideology. Divine group names were acknowledged but not pursued. This restraint reflected methodological caution. Ancient categories were treated as culturally bounded and not directly comparable to later theology. Institutional silence often reflected habit rather than policy. Archives did not issue statements about what should or should not be studied. They provided materials under existing rules. Scholars chose topics based on training, interest, and available sources. The cumulative effect was a literature rich in detail but narrow in scope. What was not required for translation or dating was often left unaddressed. By the late 20th century, popular interest in the Anunnaki emerged outside academic channels. Books written for general audiences drew on selective readings and secondary sources. Academic institutions responded by reiterating standards of evidence. Archives did not alter their practices. Materials remained accessible, but unchanged in presentation. Silence in official discourse aligned with long-standing institutional patterns. Archival practice creates visibility through structure. What is catalogued clearly and cross-referenced becomes easier to study. What remains scattered requires deliberate effort to assemble. In the case of the Anunnaki, references were numerous but diffuse. No single archive framed them as a subject. They appeared across legal texts, hymns, and inscriptions, without thematic grouping. The record, preserved in archives, shows continuity rather than intervention. Materials were acquired, stored, and made available according to established norms. Decisions about emphasis occurred at the level of individual scholars and editors. The result was a body of work focused on translation accuracy and contextual restraint. What remained unsaid reflects the structure of scholarship itself, shaped by archives that prioritized order over narrative and precision over synthesis, doctrine, boundaries, and comparative limits. By the early 20th century, the relationship between biblical scholarship and ancient Near Eastern studies had settled into a cautious equilibrium. Archaeological discoveries from Mesopotamia were no longer unexpected, yet their implications were managed carefully within theological institutions. The question was not whether older texts existed, but how they could be discussed without altering established interpretive frameworks. Boundaries were defined through method rather than decree. Catholic biblical scholarship at the turn of the century emphasized historical grounding paired with doctrinal restraint. Seminaries and pontifical institutes trained clergy to read ancient languages, but instruction was shaped by clear priorities. Hebrew, Greek, and Latin remained central. Akkadian and Sumerian were introduced as auxiliary tools, useful for understanding historical context rather than belief systems. Course descriptions framed Mesopotamian texts as background material, not parallel revelation. Formal guidance emerged gradually. Encyclicals such as Providentissimus Deus in 1893 and Divino Afflante Spiritu in 1943 encouraged engagement with original languages and historical methods, while also warning against speculative synthesis. These documents did not mention Mesopotamian deities by name. Their language was general, Interpretation was to be grounded in philology and tradition, avoiding conclusions not supported by the biblical text itself. This framework shaped how comparisons were approached. When divine assemblies appeared in Hebrew scripture, scholars acknowledged that similar structures existed in surrounding cultures. References to councils of gods in Mesopotamian literature were noted as part of a shared ancient Near Eastern milieu. The Anunnaki, when mentioned in this context, were treated as an example of literary convention rather than theological challenge. Comparison stopped at structure. Meaning was not extended beyond the immediate text. Academic publications from Catholic scholars reflect this restraint. Articles discussing the Book of Job or the Psalms sometimes reference Mesopotamian hymns or laments. The language focused on genre, form, and vocabulary. Divine names from Mesopotamia were cited sparingly, usually in footnotes. They served as evidence of shared poetic devices, not as subjects of inquiry. The Anunnaki remained peripheral, appearing only where necessary to illustrate linguistic parallels. Protestant scholarship followed a similar path, though institutional structures differed. German universities, where Assyriology was strongest, separated theology faculties from philological departments. Collaboration occurred, but boundaries were clear. Biblical scholars consulted Assyriological work for historical insight, while Assyriologists avoided theological conclusions. This separation limited the scope of comparative discussion. Each discipline maintained its own questions. Public lectures occasionally tested these limits. Friedrich Delitzsch's Babylon Bibel lectures in the early 1900s argued for strong cultural connections between Mesopotamian and biblical texts. Reaction was swift. Critics accused Delitzsch of overreach, not because he cited Mesopotamian material, but because he blurred disciplinary boundaries. Church authorities responded publicly, emphasizing methodological caution. The Anunnaki themselves were not central to the debate. The issue was process, not content. Teaching guidelines reinforced this approach. Seminary curricula included historical background courses that surveyed ancient Near Eastern cultures. Textbooks presented pantheons and mythological structures in summary form. Divine groups were listed, named, and contextualized briefly. There was no extended discussion. The purpose was orientation, not exploration. Students learned that such deities existed in surrounding cultures, then moved on. Translation choices reflected these priorities. Biblical translators avoided importing Mesopotamian terminology into scripture. Hebrew terms for divine assemblies were translated within their own linguistic tradition. Footnotes sometimes acknowledged parallels, but equivalence was avoided. This practice maintained separation between texts. The Anunnaki remained confined to their original context, untranslated into biblical language. Institutional review processes further limited expansion. Academic presses, affiliated with religious institutions, employed reviewers trained in both theology and philology. Manuscripts proposing broad comparative theories faced scrutiny. Claims had to be supported by direct textual evidence. Speculative connections were often rejected or softened. This gatekeeping did not target specific ancient names. It applied uniformly to all comparative work. The Vatican's own publications illustrate this pattern. Journals and series produced by pontifical institutes focused on scripture, patristics, and church history. When Mesopotamian material appeared, it did so as contextual reference. There were no dedicated studies of the Anunnaki. This absence reflects editorial focus rather than prohibition. Topics were chosen based on relevance to biblical interpretation. Boundaries were also shaped by audience. Theological writing addressed clergy and scholars, not the general public. Complex discussions of ancient mythologies were considered peripheral to pastoral concerns. As a result, they remained within specialized academic circles. The Anunnaki, lacking direct relevance to doctrine, did not migrate into broader discourse. By the mid-20th century, ecumenical movements encouraged dialogue between disciplines. Conferences brought together archaeologists, linguists, and theologians. Proceedings from these meetings show careful language. Speakers acknowledged ancient Near Eastern backgrounds, while reaffirming distinct interpretive traditions. Divine assemblies were discussed abstractly. Specific names were rarely emphasized. Methodological statements from this period underscore the same caution. Scholars stressed the difference between literary influence and theological meaning. Shared motifs did not imply shared belief. This distinction became a standard disclaimer in comparative studies. It functioned as a boundary marker. Within it, limited comparison was acceptable. Beyond it, discussion ceased. Popularization altered the landscape later in the century. Books aimed at general audiences presented Mesopotamian deities in simplified narratives. The Anunnaki gained visibility outside academic contexts. Religious institutions responded indirectly. Official statements reiterated the importance of critical scholarship and warned against conflating mythological literature with theology. Again, no specific names were addressed. The response focused on principle. Educational materials adapted slowly. Catechisms and teaching guides did not incorporate Mesopotamian mythology. Biblical history was taught within its own narrative arc. Ancient Near Eastern cultures were acknowledged as part of historical setting, not as interpretive keys. The Anunnaki remained absent from this level of instruction. The cumulative effect of these boundaries was a controlled comparative space. Mesopotamian texts were recognized, studied, and translated. Their structures were compared cautiously to biblical forms. Interpretation remained segmented. The Anunnaki existed within academic literature, but did not cross into doctrinal discussion. This pattern did not require enforcement. It emerged from training, publication norms, and institutional priorities. Scholars internalized limits through education and peer review. The result was a stable division of labor. Assyriology described ancient texts. Theology interpreted scripture. Points of contact were narrow and regulated. Records from the period reflect continuity rather than disruption. Minutes from academic committees, prefaces to critical editions, and methodological introductions all emphasize restraint. There is no language of threat or suppression. Instead, there is repeated emphasis on scope. What belongs to one field does not automatically belong to another. The boundaries remained in place as long as scholarship operated within institutions that valued specialization. The Anunnaki, tied to administrative and ritual language rather than narrative theology, remained outside the central concerns of doctrine. Their presence in ancient texts was acknowledged without consequence. What emerges from this history is a framework built on limitation. Comparative study was permitted within defined parameters. Names, structures, and motifs could be noted. Meaning was contained. The Anunnaki remained part of the ancient record, observed but not integrated. This outcome followed from how doctrine defined its borders, how scholarship respected them, and how comparison was practiced without expansion. Names without narratives. By the late 20th century, references to the Anunnaki had become widely scattered across academic literature, museum catalogues, dictionaries, and excavation reports. Their presence was steady but subdued. They appeared as names without stories, terms without extended explanation. This condition did not arise from loss of material, but from how material was handled once recovered, translated, and archived. In Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki rarely appear in sustained narrative form. Unlike gods such as Enlil, Inanna, or Marduk, they are seldom the subject of myths centered on individual action. Instead, they function collectively within administrative, legal, and ritual frameworks. This structural role shaped how later readers encountered them. Without stories, there was little to summarize, retell, or adapt. Textual genres reinforced this limitation. Many tablets mentioning the Anunnaki belong to administrative or liturgical categories. These include offering lists, temple inventories, oath formulas, and royal inscriptions. The language is repetitive and procedural. Names are inserted into fixed sequences alongside other divine groups. Translators reproduced these sequences faithfully, but the result offered no narrative entry point. When myths were preserved, they focused elsewhere. Creation accounts, flood stories, and divine conflicts center on a smaller set of named deities. The Anunnaki appear at the margins, often as a collective audience or authority. In the Atrahasis epic, they are referenced as part of a broader divine order, but do not drive the plot. Translators noted their presence, but did not expand upon it. This absence of narrative depth influenced later scholarship. Historians and philologists tend to focus on texts that support sustained analysis. Stories invite commentary, lists do not. The Anunnaki, embedded in lists and formulas, were less attractive subjects for extended study. Their role was acknowledged, then passed over. Museum presentation followed similar logic. Exhibits favored visually striking artifacts and texts with recognizable stories. Tablets containing administrative language were displayed as examples of early bureaucracy. Labels summarized content in broad terms. Divine names embedded in these texts were rarely explained. The Anunnaki remained invisible to non-specialist audiences. Educational materials mirrored this pattern. Introductory textbooks on ancient Mesopotamia outlined pantheons briefly. Divine groups were named, categorized, and contextualized within a few paragraphs. Attention then shifted to political history, urban development, and economic systems. The Anunnaki did not reappear. Their function was noted and set aside. Cataloging practices further contributed to dispersal. In dictionaries and glossaries, Anunnaki entries listed occurrences across genres and periods. These entries were factual and restrained. No attempt was made to synthesize meaning beyond usage. The term existed as a lexical item, not as a subject of interpretation. Indexing choices mattered. Many catalogues indexed tablets by provenance or genre rather than by divine names. A researcher searching for Anunnaki references had to consult multiple volumes and databases. This effort discouraged thematic study. Scholarly habits reinforced this outcome. Training emphasized accuracy over synthesis. Students learned to avoid speculation. Articles focused on what could be demonstrated directly from the text. The Anunnaki, lacking narrative elaboration, offered limited material for such demonstration. This peripheral status persisted even as new technologies emerged. Digital databases made texts more accessible, but search functions depended on standardized transliterations. Variations in spelling and sign usage complicated retrieval. References remained fragmented. No comprehensive narrative emerged from aggregation. Popular literature eventually filled this gap. Writers outside academic institutions assembled scattered references into cohesive stories. These accounts often imposed narrative structure where the text did not provide it. Academic responses emphasized methodological caution. Scholars pointed out the lack of narrative evidence. The original condition of names without stories was reaffirmed. Institutional reactions remained consistent. Museums, universities, and religious bodies did not revise their presentations. Academic publications continued to treat the Anunnaki as collective terms tied to specific textual functions. Silence in official discourse reflected continuity rather than response. The persistence of names without narratives illustrates how knowledge is shaped by form. Texts that do not tell stories resist incorporation into larger frameworks. They remain technical, procedural, and localized. The Anunnaki exemplify this condition. They exist firmly within the ancient record, yet outside interpretive focus. This status was not accidental. It emerged from the nature of the sources and the priorities of those who studied them. Translation preserved structure. Scholarship preserved restraint. Together, these factors produced a stable outcome. The Anunnaki remained present but undefined. Their names circulated without elaboration. They were acknowledged where required and ignored where unnecessary. This pattern endured across generations of scholarship. What can be observed is not absence but containment. Names were recorded accurately and repeatedly. Narratives were not supplied. Meaning was limited to function. The Anunnaki remained part of the documentary background of Mesopotamian civilization, visible to specialists and largely unnoticed beyond them. Preservation, loss, and what survived. The survival of Mesopotamian texts was never uniform or evenly distributed. What entered the modern record did so through a long sequence of material accidents, environmental pressures, and human choices layered across millennia. Clay tablets endure under certain conditions and fail under others. They survive when baked by fire, sealed by collapse, or buried beyond disturbance. They decay when exposed to moisture, reused as raw material, or crushed under later construction. The surviving corpus is therefore not an archive preserved by intention, but a remainder shaped by circumstance. Most cuneiform tablets were created for immediate and limited use. Administrative records documented daily activities, grain rations, livestock counts, labor assignments, tax deliveries, and temple inventories. These tablets served a practical function within a specific time frame. Once that function expired, the tablets were no longer necessary. Some were stored temporarily in baskets or shelves. Others were discarded, broken, or recycled. Only a small proportion were copied or retained for reference. Deliberate archiving occurred primarily in temples and palaces. These institutions accumulated texts across generations. Legal documents, royal inscriptions, hymns, and scholarly compositions were stored as part of institutional memory. Even these collections were not designed for permanence. Storage rooms were reorganized, cleared, or repurposed. Shelves collapsed, tablets fell, shattered, and mixed. Preservation depended less on intention than on later destruction. Fire played an uneven role. When buildings burned, unfired clay tablets hardened and survived. At the same time, collapsing roofs and walls crushed them into fragments. Many tablets recovered from sites like Nineveh were preserved because the palace was destroyed by fire. Others in the same complex were pulverized beyond recognition. Fire did not preserve entire archives. Mesopotamian cities were built in floodplains shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Seasonal flooding deposited layers of silt that gradually buried structures. In some cases, this burial sealed tablets away from later disturbance. In other cases, water infiltration softened clay and erased inscriptions. Tablets buried in damp soil absorbed moisture and dissolved. Survival depended on depth, soil composition, and drainage conditions. Architecture mattered. Tablets embedded in collapsed walls or floors often survived better than those stored on shelves. Those placed near doorways or courtyards were more likely to be disturbed. Tablets stored in upper levels were vulnerable to collapse. The precise location of a tablet within a building could determine whether it survived intact, fragmented, or not at all. Royal archives had a higher survival rate than private collections. Palaces and major temples were larger and constructed with more durable materials. When destroyed, they left dense concentrations of tablets. Excavations at Nineveh uncovered rooms filled with thousands of fragments from collapsed shelves. These assemblages reflect institutional priorities. What was written for kings and gods had a higher chance of survival than what was written for households. Even within royal and temple archives, preservation was uneven. Some texts were written on unfired clay, intended for short-term use. Others were deliberately baked for longevity. Literary and ritual compositions were often copied repeatedly as part of scribal training. Their survival reflects both copying practices and physical durability. Administrative texts, written quickly and discarded, survived only when circumstances intervened. The survival of texts is therefore tied to scribal culture. Scribal schools preserved certain compositions through repetition. Students copied hymns, prayers, and standard literary works. These texts exist today in multiple copies from different sites. Variants reveal the process of copying rather than original composition. Administrative records lacked this mechanism. They survived only as originals, not as copies. Excavation practices introduced additional loss. Early excavations in the 19th century prioritized monumental architecture, reliefs, and statues. Tablets were often treated as secondary finds. Some were overlooked, others were damaged during removal. Contemporary excavation reports describe baskets of tablets broken during transport. Provenance information was frequently lost. Tablets were shipped without detailed records of their original location. Documentation standards improved slowly. Early excavators recorded find spots inconsistently. Some tablets were labeled only with site names. Others lacked any contextual information. Without precise provenance, reconstructing archive structure became difficult. Tablets from different rooms or periods were mixed. This mixing obscured original relationships between texts. Restoration practices further shaped the record. Conservators cleaned tablets to remove incrustation. Some tablets were baked to stabilize them, altering their surface. Fragments were joined based on handwriting and content. Some joins were correct, others were speculative. Decisions made during restoration affected how texts were read and interpreted. Tablets deemed too fragmentary were set aside, their contents unread. Translation depends on legibility. Broken signs limit certainty. Missing lines restrict context. In many references to the Anunnaki, the surrounding text is incomplete. The term appears in formulaic phrases where the rest of the passage is damaged. Translators reproduce what survives and mark gaps. They do not supply missing material. Meaning remains constrained by absence. Loss also occurred through reuse. In antiquity, clay was valuable. Old tablets could be soaked and reshaped. Bricks containing inscriptions were reused in later buildings. In some cases, inscribed bricks were placed face inward, preserving text until excavation. In others, inscriptions were worn away. Many texts were destroyed entirely through reuse. The survival of certain genres reflects institutional copying priorities. Literary texts were preserved through education. Ritual texts were copied for temple use. Legal texts were archived for reference. Administrative texts lacked long-term value. Their survival depended on storage conditions rather than tradition. This imbalance shapes the modern corpus. Environmental conditions varied across regions. Southern Mesopotamia's wet soil preserved fewer tablets than the drier north. As a result, archives from cities like Uruk and Eridu are more fragmentary than those from Assyrian capitals such as Nineveh and Ashur. References to the Anunnaki are more common in better preserved northern archives. Modern conflict introduced new losses. Looting, war, and neglect damaged sites and collections. Tablets were stolen, sold, or destroyed. Illicit trade removed objects from scholarly access. Entire archives were dispersed into private collections. Some tablets resurfaced without context. Others vanished. Museums also experienced loss. Fires, bombings, and neglect damaged collections. Emergency measures prioritized preservation over research. Documentation was interrupted. Some tablets were lost during evacuation. Others were mislabeled. Recovery took decades. Digital preservation has expanded access, but cannot restore what is lost. Scans and photographs record existing fragments. They preserve current condition. They do not recover missing context. Reconstruction remains limited by the original state of the material. Digital tools reveal patterns, but cannot fill gaps. The surviving record is therefore partial and shaped by circumstance. The Anunnaki appear where tablets endured. Their absence elsewhere does not indicate omission by ancient writers. It reflects loss. Preservation determines visibility. What survives appears intentional only in retrospect. The corpus that remains is shaped by fire, water, collapse, excavation, and restoration. Survival favored institutional records and formulaic language. Narrative richness was less likely to endure. The Anunnaki, embedded in procedural texts, survived as names without elaboration. Loss is integral to interpretation. The record is not neutral, it reflects material history. Interpretation must account for what is missing as much as for what is present. Absence does not imply insignificance, it indicates vulnerability. The surviving texts offer consistency rather than completeness. They show how divine groups functioned within systems of law, ritual, and administration. They do not reveal full cosmologies. This limitation is structural. It arises from what was preserved, not from what was written. Preservation shaped scholarship by defining its boundaries. What could be read, could be studied. What was lost remained unknown. The Anunnaki occupy the space defined by survival. They are present where material endured and absent where it did not. This condition has remained constant. New discoveries add fragments but do not transform the pattern. The record grows slowly. It remains constrained by ancient processes of loss. What emerges is a picture of continuity shaped by absence. The Anunnaki remain part of the surviving administrative and ritual framework. Their limited narrative presence reflects both ancient practice and modern preservation. The history of loss is inseparable from the history of interpretation. What survives shapes what can be known. The Anunnaki stand as an example of how preservation defines knowledge, leaving names intact while stories remain fragmentary. Modern popularization and the shift in meaning. By the final decades of the 20th century, references to the Anunnaki began to appear outside academic and institutional settings with increasing frequency. This shift did not originate from new archaeological discoveries or revised translations. It emerged from a change in audience. Texts that had long circulated within specialist circles were reintroduced to the public through popular books, magazines, documentaries, and later digital media. The framing changed. Academic Assyriology had produced a stable body of translations by the mid-20th century. These translations were technical, cautious, and context-bound. They were written for scholars trained in cuneiform and ancient languages. Outside that environment, access was limited. Most readers encountered Mesopotamian material indirectly, through summaries embedded in broader histories of civilization. Popularization altered this pathway. Authors writing for general audiences selected fragments of translated material and reorganized them into linear narratives. Lists and formulaic references were treated as clues. Gaps created by loss or damage were filled with connective language. The Anunnaki, previously encountered as collective terms within administrative or ritual contexts, were repositioned as central figures within reconstructed stories. This process relied heavily on selectivity. Popular works often drew from a narrow range of texts, sometimes quoting the same passages repeatedly. Administrative phrases, invoking the Anunnaki, as witnesses were presented alongside mythological fragments, without attention to genre. Differences between Sumerian and Akkadian usage were minimized. Chronological distance between texts was compressed. What had been separated by centuries appeared unified. Translation choices played a role. Academic translations favored restraint. Popular authors sometimes preferred alternative renderings drawn from older editions or less conservative readings. Words translated as assembly or council were reinterpreted as governing bodies. Neutral terms acquired hierarchical implications. These shifts occurred without revisiting the original cuneiform context. The absence of narrative in the source material encouraged supplementation. Where tablets were silent, explanatory passages were introduced. Collective divine names were assigned roles. Functions implied by administrative language were expanded into motives and actions. This process did not require falsification. It required rearrangement. Existing words were placed into new sequences. Media formats amplified these changes. Television documentaries favored coherent storylines. Complex scholarly uncertainty was difficult to convey within limited timeframes. Ambiguity was reduced. The Anunnaki were presented as identifiable entities rather than as grammatical categories. Visual reconstructions reinforced this perception. Names became characters. Digital media accelerated dissemination. Online articles, forums, and video platforms circulated simplified accounts widely. Citations were often indirect. Translations were excerpted without context. Images of tablets were paired with speculative interpretations. The boundary between academic translation and popular narrative blurred. Institutional responses remained limited. Universities and museums continued their established practices. Academic publications maintained methodological standards. When popular interpretations were addressed, responses focused on process rather than content. Scholars emphasized genre, chronology, and linguistic caution. They did not produce counter-narratives. Silence reflected disciplinary boundaries rather than disengagement. Museums adapted partially. Some exhibitions acknowledged popular interest by expanding explanatory panels. Even then, language remained careful. Divine groups were described as part of Mesopotamian belief systems without elaboration. The Anunnaki were named and contextualized briefly. No narrative expansion was offered. Educational curricula remained largely unchanged. University courses on Mesopotamia continued to emphasize administrative, legal, and economic texts. Popular interpretations were discussed occasionally as examples of reception history. The distinction between ancient sources and modern narratives was maintained. The shift in meaning occurred primarily outside institutional control. Popularization operates independently of peer review. It values coherence and engagement. Fragmentary evidence becomes material for synthesis. The Anunnaki's limited narrative presence made them adaptable. Their ambiguity allowed reinterpretation. This shift did not erase academic understanding. It created a parallel discourse. Within scholarship, The Anunnaki remained a collective term tied to specific textual functions. Outside it, they became symbols of broader ideas about antiquity. The same name carried different meanings depending on context. The process illustrates how meaning changes through transmission. Texts move from archive to translation, from translation to summary, from summary to narrative. Each step introduces selection. Over time, original constraints fade. What remains is shaped by audience expectation. The modern visibility of the Anunnaki reflects this pathway. They did not emerge from new evidence. They emerged from reinterpretation. Their prominence increased as distance from the source material grew. This development altered public perception of Mesopotamian religion. Divine groups, once understood as part of administrative and ritual language, became focal points of speculation. Academic caution was often interpreted as omission. Silence was taken as absence of explanation, rather than as methodological restraint. The divergence between scholarly and popular meaning continues. Academic literature remains consistent. Popular narratives evolve rapidly. Both draw from the same ancient material. They differ in structure and purpose. What can be observed is not replacement, but layering. New meanings accumulate over older ones. The Anunnaki exists simultaneously as a technical term in cuneiform studies and as a narrative construct in popular culture. Each usage follows its own rules. This chapter of transmission highlights how preservation and loss extend beyond physical material. Meaning itself is preserved, altered, or lost through retelling. The Anunnaki illustrate how fragmentary records invite reconstruction once removed from their original scholarly context. The shift in meaning did not require institutional action. It occurred through circulation. Its modern interpretation diversified. What survives now is not only clay tablets but competing frameworks of understanding. One is constrained by material and method. The other is shaped by narrative need. Both draw from the same source. Their divergence reflects the pathways through which ancient texts reach modern audiences: silence, interpretation, and institutional distance. As popular reinterpretations of Mesopotamian material expanded in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, institutional responses followed a familiar pattern. They did not take the form of public refutations, formal condemnations, or corrective campaigns. Instead, they remained largely unchanged. Universities, museums, and religious bodies continued their existing practices. This continuity created a visible contrast between growing public narratives and stable academic silence. Within academic institutions, silence did not indicate lack of awareness. Scholars of Assyriology, Near Eastern history, and biblical studies were aware of popular books and media treatments. References appeared occasionally in reviews, conference remarks, and classroom discussions. These references were usually brief. They framed popular interpretations as reception history rather than scholarship. Engagement ended there. Peer-reviewed journals maintained established standards. Articles continued to focus on philology, archaeology, chronology, and material culture. Editorial policies favored narrow claims, supported by direct evidence. Manuscripts proposing expansive reinterpretations of divine groups were rare. When submitted, they were often redirected or rejected for lack of methodological grounding. This process occurred quietly, without public commentary. Museums adopted a similar stance. Exhibition design emphasized artifact context, provenance, and function. Labels were concise. They avoided speculative language. As public interest in ancient deities grew, some museums expanded educational programming. Lectures and guided tours addressed how myths functioned within ancient societies. Even then, explanations remained bounded. The Anunnaki were described as part of a broader pantheon, without narrative elaboration. Religious institutions followed long-standing patterns of distance. Official publications did not address popular reinterpretations directly. Theological journals focused on scripture, tradition, and historical theology. When ancient Near Eastern material appeared, it was framed as background. Silence functioned as adherence to scope. Subjects outside doctrinal relevance were not incorporated. This institutional distance was reinforced by specialization. Scholars trained within defined disciplines learn what questions are appropriate. Assyriologists focus on texts. Theologians focus on doctrine. Historians focus on context. Popular narratives often cross these boundaries. Institutions rarely follow. Silence marks the boundary. Public perception interpreted this silence differently. In popular discourse, absence of response was sometimes read as avoidance or suppression. Within institutions, it was understood as non-engagement. The same behavior carried different meanings depending on perspective. This divergence widened as popular narratives became more visible. Academic training explains much of this distance. Graduate education emphasizes caution. Students learn to distinguish evidence from interpretation. They are taught to avoid extrapolation beyond the text. Popular reinterpretations often do the opposite. They synthesize broadly. Institutions do not respond by adopting these methods. Citation practices also contribute. Academic work builds on prior scholarship. Popular works often cite selectively or indirectly. This difference limits dialogue. Scholars are reluctant to engage with material that does not follow shared conventions. Silence becomes a practical outcome. Institutional memory reinforces stability. Universities and museums change slowly. Curricula, catalogues, and collections evolve incrementally. Popular media changes rapidly. Institutions are not structured to respond to each new narrative trend. Silence reflects this temporal mismatch. When responses do occur, they are often indirect. Scholars publish methodological essays emphasizing standards of evidence. Museums release educational resources explaining how ancient texts are interpreted. Religious institutions issue general statements about responsible scholarship. None address specific popular claims. The focus remains on process. This restraint preserves institutional authority. By not engaging directly, institutions avoid legitimizing speculative narratives. Silence prevents amplification. Within institutional logic, engagement can elevate marginal interpretations. Distance contains them. Over time, this pattern shapes public understanding. Popular narratives circulate freely. Institutional voices remain quiet. Audiences interpret silence through their own frameworks. For some, it confirms suspicion. For others, it passes unnoticed. Institutions accept this ambiguity. The Anunnaki occupy a central position in this dynamic. Their limited narrative role in ancient texts contrasts sharply with their prominence in modern stories. Institutions continue to treat them as collective terms within specific genres. Popular media treats them as agents within expansive histories. Silence allows both interpretations to coexist without resolution. This coexistence reflects structural separation rather than conflict. Institutions do not seek to control popular meaning. They maintain internal coherence. It arises from how knowledge is organized. Historical precedent supports this approach. Similar patterns occurred with other ancient subjects. Interpretations of pyramids, Stonehenge, and early mythologies followed parallel trajectories. Popular narratives expanded. Institutions responded with restraint. Over time, some ideas faded. Others persisted. Silence also protects scholarly uncertainty. Many questions remain unresolved due to fragmentary evidence. Institutions avoid filling gaps. Popular narratives fill them readily. The difference highlights contrasting goals. One seeks accuracy within limits. The other seeks completeness. This division does not imply opposition. It reflects different modes of knowledge production. Institutions prioritize verification. Popular media prioritizes coherence. Silence maintains separation. As digital platforms continue to amplify reinterpretations, institutional distance remains consistent. Museums digitize collections. Universities publish open-access research. Religious institutions maintain doctrinal focus. None alter their core approach. What emerges is a layered interpretive landscape. Ancient texts exist at the base. Academic scholarship builds cautiously upon them. Popular narratives build expansively. Institutional silence preserves the boundaries between these layers. The Anunnaki remain unchanged within the scholarly record. Their role in ancient texts is stable. What changes is the interpretive environment around them. Silence allows that environment to evolve independently, the Anunnaki in contemporary memory. By the early 21st century, the Anunnaki occupied a position in modern culture that differed sharply from their role in ancient texts. They were no longer encountered primarily through translations of cuneiform tablets or academic reference works. Instead, they appeared through repetition across media, shaped by summaries, reinterpretations, and symbolic reuse. Memory replaced documentation as the dominant mode through which the name circulated. Contemporary memory does not rely on direct engagement with original sources. It operates through accumulation. A reference appears in a book, then again in a documentary, then in an online article, then in a video clip. Over time, the name becomes detached from its original textual environment. What remains is recognition rather than context. The Anunnaki entered this cycle gradually. Early popular works introduced the name as part of broader discussions about ancient civilizations. These works often cited academic translations but rearranged them for narrative flow. Later media repeated these interpretations without returning to the source material. Citations became indirect. The name persisted, even as references to specific tablets faded. Digital platforms accelerated this process. Search engines, recommendation systems, and algorithmic feeds favored content that reused recognizable terms. The Anunnaki became a stable keyword. Articles and videos that included the name were grouped together regardless of accuracy or approach. This clustering reinforced a shared but generalized image. Within this environment, memory functioned differently from scholarship. Scholarship depends on verification. Memory depends on recall. Details that are repeated survive. Those that require explanation are often lost. The Anunnaki, lacking a clear narrative in ancient sources, acquired one through modern association. Their original administrative and ritual context became secondary. Visual representation played a significant role. Illustrations, animations, and speculative reconstructions provided concrete forms where texts had offered none. Images circulated widely. Once established, these visuals became reference points. They shaped expectation. Language also shifted. In academic contexts, the Anunnaki remained a collective noun. In popular memory, the term was often treated as a singular group with unified purpose. Grammatical nuance disappeared. What had been a category became an entity. This change occurred through repetition rather than argument. Contemporary memory favors coherence. Fragmentary evidence is difficult to remember. Complete stories are easier. As a result, gaps in the ancient record were filled implicitly. Lists became hierarchies. Formulaic phrases became declarations. Over time, these additions felt original to the memory itself. Educational pathways contributed to this transformation. Outside specialized courses, ancient Mesopotamia is often taught briefly, if at all. Students encounter simplified timelines and key terms. The Anunnaki, when mentioned, appear as part of a generalized ancient belief system. Without extended explanation, the name enters memory without structure. Cultural reuse reinforced this abstraction. References appeared in fiction, music, and art. These uses were symbolic rather than historical. Each reuse detached the name further from its textual origins. Meaning accumulated through association. The persistence of the name does not indicate continuity of understanding. It indicates continuity of recognition. Many modern references rely on earlier popular works rather than on primary sources. This creates a closed loop. Memory feeds on itself. The original texts remain unchanged, but their role in shaping perception diminishes. Institutional materials remained available throughout this period. Museums continued to display tablets. Universities continued to publish translations. Digital archives increased access to primary sources. Yet these materials required effort to consult. Memory favored what was easily retrievable and already familiar. The Anunnaki thus became part of a broader category of ancient names that circulate independently of documentation. Their meaning varies by context. In academic writing, it remains narrow and specific. In popular memory, it is expansive and fluid. Both uses coexist without direct interaction. This coexistence highlights the difference between historical record and cultural memory. The historical record is fixed by material survival. Cultural memory evolves through repetition. The Anunnaki illustrate how a term can remain stable in one domain and mutable in another. The modern image of the Anunnaki does not replace the ancient one, it overlays it. The original texts remain available, but they are no longer the primary reference point for most audiences. Memory operates on summaries, not sources. This process mirrors other cases in ancient history. Names such as Atlantis, Babylon, or Tartarus have followed similar paths. Repetition reshapes significance, context recedes. What is distinctive about the Anunnaki is the lack of narrative constraint in the original material. The absence of detail invited completion. Memory supplied what documentation did not. The role of silence remains relevant here. Institutions did not intervene to correct memory. They continued to present original material within scholarly frameworks. Popular memory evolved independently. This separation allowed divergence without conflict. Contemporary memory is not fixed. It continues to change as new media forms emerge. References adapt to platform norms. The Anunnaki appear differently in long-form books than in short videos or images. Each format compresses meaning differently. Despite this variation, certain elements remain consistent. The name persists. Its association with deep antiquity remains. These features anchor memory even as details shift. Recognition precedes understanding. The Anunnaki now exist within a layered temporal structure. At one level, they remain part of the ancient Mesopotamian record, preserved in clay and translation. At another, they exist as a modern cultural symbol, shaped by repetition and reinterpretation. Understanding this distinction clarifies how ancient material functions in the present. The past does not arrive intact. It is mediated by preservation, translation, dissemination, and memory. Each stage alters emphasis. The Anunnaki exemplify this process. Their journey from administrative term to cultural symbol reflects how knowledge moves beyond archives. Meaning changes without altering the source. What survives today is therefore twofold. There is the material record, limited and fragmentary. There is also the memory record, expansive and adaptive. Both persist simultaneously. The discussion of contemporary memory does not resolve earlier questions. It reframes them. The focus shifts from what ancient texts say to how modern audiences remember. The Anunnaki occupy that space between record and recall. Their presence in contemporary memory says less about ancient belief than about modern processes of meaning-making. Memory does not require completeness. It requires repetition. The Anunnaki continue to circulate because the name endures. Its endurance reflects recognition rather than explanation. The ancient tablets remain unchanged. The modern image remains flexible. This dynamic illustrates how preservation and loss extend beyond material survival. Meaning itself is preserved, altered, or expanded through memory. The Anunnaki stand at the intersection of these processes, unchanged in clay, transformed in recall. Authority, interpretation, and who decides meaning. Authority in the interpretation of ancient material does not emerge from a single source. It is distributed across institutions, disciplines, and practices that developed over time. In the study of Mesopotamian texts, authority has been shaped by who controls access to material, who is trained to read it, and who is permitted to publish interpretations. These factors operate quietly, through structure rather than declaration. The earliest authority over cuneiform texts rested with excavators and collectors. In the 19th century, individuals such as Austin Henry Layard and Hormuz Rassam determined which sites were excavated, which objects were removed, and which were prioritized for shipment. Their decisions were guided by funding, diplomacy, and the interests of sponsoring institutions. Tablets entered museums as artifacts before they became texts. Authority began with possession. Once housed in museums, authority shifted toward cataloging and preservation. Curators assigned numbers, organized storage, and determined handling procedures. Access depended on institutional permission. Scholars requested tablets through formal channels. The ability to study a text relied on approval, availability, and physical proximity. Training established another layer of authority. Reading cuneiform requires specialized knowledge acquired through long study. Assyriology developed as a technical discipline with its own standards, terminology, and methods. Mastery of sign lists, grammar, and genre conventions became prerequisites for participation. Authority was conferred through competence rather than position. Publication reinforced this structure. Peer-reviewed journals and academic presses acted as gatekeepers. Editors and reviewers evaluated submissions based on methodological rigor and adherence to disciplinary norms. Interpretations had to be grounded in philology and context. Claims extending beyond the text faced resistance. Over time, this process stabilized, accepted readings and marginalized speculative approaches. Authority also emerged through reference works. Dictionaries, sign lists, and critical editions codified meanings and usages. Once published, these works became standards. Later scholars cited them rather than revisiting primary evidence. Authority accumulated through repetition. A translation printed in a dictionary acquired weight through use. Institutions further consolidated authority. Universities created departments and degree programs. Museums developed research divisions. Funding agencies supported certain projects over others. These structures guided what questions were asked and which materials were prioritized. Authority followed institutional alignment. Religious institutions engaged with ancient material through their own frameworks. Catholic and Protestant scholars incorporated Near Eastern studies as contextual tools rather than as interpretive foundations. Authority within these institutions derived from doctrinal tradition combined with historical method. Ancient texts were acknowledged but kept within defined boundaries. Interpretation remained segmented. Authority is also temporal. Early interpretations often persist even when revised evidence emerges. Foundational translations influence later readings. Corrections appear in footnotes or revised editions, but earlier phrasing remains embedded in scholarship. Authority accumulates historically. What was accepted once continues to shape understanding. The role of language reinforces this effect. Technical vocabulary limits participation. Terms such as collective noun, liturgical formula, or administrative context signal disciplinary membership. Authority is communicated through language. Those outside the field may encounter difficulty engaging directly with primary scholarship. Popular interpretation operates differently. Authority in popular discourse often derives from visibility rather than training. Books, documentaries, and online content reach wide audiences. Repetition creates credibility. A narrative repeated across platforms gains acceptance, regardless of source. Authority emerges through circulation. This difference creates parallel systems. Academic authority rests on method and review. Popular authority rests on recognition and coherence. Each system evaluates meaning differently. Conflict arises not from disagreement over evidence, but from disagreement over who has the right to interpret. The Anunnaki exemplify this divide. In academic contexts, authority defines them narrowly, based on textual function. In popular contexts, authority expands them into narrative figures. Each interpretation follows its own rules. Neither directly displaces the other. Institutional silence plays a role here. By declining to engage with popular reinterpretations, academic institutions preserve their authority internally while allowing external narratives to proliferate. Silence avoids legitimization. It also avoids confrontation. Authority is maintained through continuity rather than response. Educational systems reinforce these boundaries. Students trained in ancient history learn how authority is constructed. They study editions, commentaries, and peer-reviewed debates. Popular narratives are often excluded from curricula. This exclusion is procedural, not punitive. Authority is transmitted through pedagogy. Archives embody authority physically. Controlled access, handling rules, and catalog systems regulate engagement. The archive determines what can be seen and how. Authority is embedded in architecture and policy. The material record is mediated before interpretation begins. Digital access has altered but not eliminated these structures. Online databases make texts more visible. However, interpretation still requires training. Authority shifts slightly toward accessibility, but remains anchored in expertise. Digital images do not equal comprehension. Authority is also negotiated through citation. Academic work builds upon recognized sources. Popular work often cites broadly or indirectly. This difference limits dialogue. Without shared citation practices, authority remains separate. Over time, these systems coexist. Academic authority remains stable within institutions. Popular authority evolves rapidly. Each influences public perception differently. The Anunnaki exist at the intersection of these systems. Who decides meaning depends on context. Within academia, meaning is decided through method and consensus. Within popular culture, meaning is decided through repetition and resonance. Neither system operates universally. Each has boundaries. This layered authority does not imply deception or control. It reflects structural differences in knowledge production. Ancient texts do not speak for themselves. They are mediated by those who read, translate, and present them. Authority arises from that mediation. The history of the Anunnaki shows how authority shapes interpretation without explicit enforcement. Scholars limit claims through method. Institutions limit engagement through scope. Popular media expands meaning through narrative. Authority disperses rather than concentrates. Interpretation is therefore not a single act but a process. It unfolds through access, training, publication, repetition, and memory. Authority guides each stage. The result is multiple meanings attached to the same ancient term. This multiplicity persists because no single authority controls all contexts. Ancient material circulates across domains. Each domain assigns value differently. The Anunnaki remain stable in clay and variable in interpretation. Understanding who decides meaning requires attention to structure rather than intent. Authority is embedded in systems that operate continuously. These systems shape what is said, what is left unsaid, and what is repeated. The Anunnaki continue to be interpreted within these frameworks. Academic meaning remains constrained. Popular meaning remains expansive. Authority governs each without direct conflict. What emerges is not a hierarchy but a landscape. Different authorities occupy different spaces. Meaning shifts as material moves between them. Records that remain, questions that do not close. The surviving Mesopotamian record presents itself as a fixed body of material, yet it does not function as a closed system. Clay tablets endure as physical objects with measurable properties, legible signs, and established provenance. At the same time, they continue to generate questions that are neither resolved nor exhausted by translation. What remains is stable. What it allows remains open. Cuneiform texts exist within limits imposed by material survival. Each tablet preserves a bounded surface. Lines break where clay fractured. Signs fade where water eroded edges. Gaps interrupt sequences. These constraints define what can be read. They also define what cannot. The record is complete only in fragments. Absence is built into its structure. Scholars approach this material with awareness of those limits. Editions mark breaks and lacunae explicitly. Missing signs are noted. Reconstructions are signaled with brackets. This practice preserves uncertainty rather than eliminating it. The record remains readable without claiming fullness. Meaning is constrained by what survives. The Anunnaki appear within this condition. Their name is preserved in multiple genres and periods, yet always within bounded contexts. They are present in legal formulas, ritual lists, hymns, and administrative language. They are not preserved as narrative agents with extended action. This absence does not require explanation. It reflects what was written, what was copied, and what endured. Questions arise at the edges of these texts. Why certain divine groups appear repeatedly in formulaic language? Why others dominate narrative compositions? Why some names persist across centuries while others disappear? These questions are recognized within scholarship. They are addressed cautiously, through comparison and context. They are not closed. The process of study continues through accumulation rather than resolution. New fragments are identified. Old fragments are rejoined. Readings are refined. Chronologies are adjusted. None of these steps complete the record. They clarify portions of it. Each clarification introduces further boundaries. Archaeological work continues to add material unevenly. Excavations yield tablets in specific regions and layers. Political conditions, funding, and access determine where work occurs. Entire archives remain buried. Others have been destroyed. The future record will expand selectively. Its shape will remain irregular. Digital tools have changed access without altering incompleteness. Databases aggregate texts from dispersed collections. Search functions allow patterns to be identified. Yet digital completeness depends on physical survival. Missing tablets do not appear through digitization. Absence remains. The interpretive posture within scholarship reflects this condition. Caution is not provisional, it is structural. Claims are limited to what can be demonstrated. When evidence does not permit expansion, interpretation stops. This restraint leaves many questions open by design. The Anunnaki occupy a stable place within that restraint. Their function is described. Their usage is documented. Their presence is acknowledged. Their role is not extended beyond the text. This approach does not suggest secrecy or avoidance. It reflects method. Open questions persist without pressure toward closure. Ancient belief systems are not reconstructed as unified doctrines. They are described as collections of practices, texts, and conventions that varied by time and place. The Anunnaki fit within that variability. They do not require a single explanation. The absence of resolution does not indicate failure. In historical study, unresolved questions are common. They signal the limits of evidence rather than gaps in effort. The Mesopotamian record remains productive precisely because it is incomplete. Each fragment invites careful attention. Institutional frameworks support this ongoing condition. Museums preserve tablets. Universities train specialists. Journals publish incremental findings. None of these structures aim to complete the record. They aim to maintain it. Stability allows continued inquiry without expectation of finality. Popular narratives often seek closure. They favor complete stories. Academic practice does not share that requirement. It allows partial understanding to remain partial. The Anunnaki illustrate this difference clearly. Their ancient record remains unchanged. Interpretive expansion occurs elsewhere. The record that remains therefore functions as a reference point rather than a conclusion. It anchors discussion. It constrains speculation. It does not answer every question raised around it. That imbalance persists. Questions about meaning, authority, and interpretation continue to circulate. They do so alongside the material record, not within it. The tablets do not respond to reinterpretation. They remain as they were inscribed. Their endurance is physical, not explanatory. The Anunnaki remain visible within this enduring record. Their name appears where it was written. It does not adapt to new frameworks. It does not expand. It remains tied to clay, signs, and context. That stability contrasts with the variability of modern interpretation. What persists across time is the distinction between record and meaning. The record is finite. Meaning is negotiated. This negotiation does not resolve into a single outcome. It continues as long as the material is read and reread. The Mesopotamian corpus does not point toward a final synthesis. It supports ongoing description. Each generation of scholarship inherits the same limits, supplemented by modest additions. The Anunnaki remain part of that inheritance. Their presence does not demand closure. It demonstrates how ancient terms persist without narrative completion. They exist as part of a system that functioned without modern expectations of coherence. The record that remains therefore resists final framing. It offers evidence without conclusion. It supports study without resolution. The Anunnaki stand within that condition, neither hidden nor explained beyond their textual role. What continues is attention. Tablets are read. Signs are compared. Contexts are refined. Questions remain open. The record does not close. After the tablets were read, once Mesopotamian texts entered modern circulation, their role changed. In antiquity, clay tablets functioned within living systems of administration, ritual, and instruction. They were read by scribes trained for specific tasks. They were consulted, copied, corrected, and eventually set aside. In the modern world, they function as artifacts. Their purpose is no longer operational. It is evidentiary. This shift alters how meaning is approached. Ancient readers encountered tablets as part of ongoing practice. Modern readers encounter them as remnants. The distance between these contexts shapes interpretation. What was once routine becomes obscure. What was once assumed must be reconstructed. The act of reading cuneiform today is mediated through layers of process. Excavation removes tablets from their original environment. Conservation stabilizes them. Cataloging assigns numbers. Photography reproduces images. Transliteration converts signs into Latin characters. Translation renders meaning into modern language. Each step introduces structure. Each step limits possibility. None of these processes recreate ancient use. They approximate it. Modern editions present texts line by line, isolated from the rooms, shelves, and rituals in which they once functioned. Even the most careful reconstruction cannot fully restore original conditions. The tablet remains present. Its world does not. This separation influences interpretation. Modern readers expect texts to convey information directly. Ancient texts often assumed shared context. Administrative formulas required no explanation. Ritual lists relied on prior knowledge. Divine names, including the Anunnaki, were embedded in systems understood by their users. Modern readers encounter those names without that framework. As a result, interpretation tends to focus on what can be demonstrated explicitly. Scholars describe usage, frequency, and context. They avoid attributing intent beyond the text. This approach preserves accuracy, but limits narrative reconstruction. The Anunnaki remain fixed within their recorded functions. The contrast between ancient use and modern study also affects expectations. Modern audiences often look for explanation where ancient texts offered reference. Lists are expected to imply hierarchy. Titles are expected to define roles. When texts do not supply these details, modern readers may infer them. Scholarship resists this impulse. It documents what is present and marks what is not. Material condition reinforces this restraint. Tablets are fragmentary. Breaks interrupt meaning. Signs are missing. Lines are incomplete. Reconstruction is possible only within narrow bounds. Excessive inference risks error. The physical state of the material enforces caution. The Anunnaki appear consistently within this constrained environment. Their name is legible. Their grammatical role is clear. Their narrative role is minimal. This consistency across genres and periods suggests stability of function rather than omission. They were not written as characters in extended stories. They were written as part of structure. Modern interpretation must accommodate this difference. Ancient texts do not align with modern categories of myth or doctrine. They reflect practical and ceremonial needs. Divine groups functioned within systems of legitimacy and order. Their presence supported authority rather than narrative. The modern desire for synthesis contrasts with ancient textual practice. Modern readers often seek comprehensive explanations. Ancient texts distributed meaning across genres and contexts. No single tablet explains a system. Understanding emerges from accumulation rather than exposition. This mode resists summary. The study of Mesopotamian religion, therefore, proceeds incrementally. Scholars examine individual texts, compare usage, and identify patterns. They refrain from constructing unified cosmologies unless supported by evidence. The Anunnaki remain part of these patterns without becoming central figures. This approach shapes how knowledge is transmitted. Academic publications emphasize method. Museum displays emphasize context. Educational materials emphasize overview. None aim to recreate ancient belief systems in full. They present fragments within explanatory frames. Popular narratives often diverge at this point. They seek to restore coherence. They assemble fragments into complete stories. This difference in aim explains divergent interpretations. It does not imply disagreement over evidence. It reflects different purposes. The modern scholarly posture remains consistent. It acknowledges limits. It accepts incompleteness. It treats absence as data rather than deficiency. The Anunnaki exemplify this posture. Their limited narrative presence is recorded, not corrected. The persistence of open questions is therefore expected. Ancient texts do not answer modern curiosity fully. They were not written for that purpose. Modern study respects this difference by maintaining boundaries between evidence and interpretation. What follows the reading of tablets is not conclusion but continuation. Each generation revisits the material with new tools and perspectives. Interpretations adjust slightly. Core constraints remain. The Anunnaki continue to be read where they appear and left undefined where they do not. This condition reflects the nature of historical knowledge. It is cumulative but not convergent. Evidence increases without resolving all questions. Meaning remains provisional. The record supports inquiry rather than closure. The tablets endure as fixed objects. Their inscriptions do not change. Interpretation evolves around them. The Anunnaki remain anchored to clay, signs, and context. Their modern significance varies with the frameworks applied. After the tablets were read, they did not speak further. They continue to be examined, compared, and cited. They do not explain themselves. Their endurance lies in material presence, not in narrative clarity. What remains is engagement. Scholars read carefully. Institutions preserve patiently. Audiences interpret variously. The Anunnaki persist within this landscape as they always have. Recorded, legible, and limited by what was written. The ancient record does not close. It stabilizes. Modern interpretation moves around it, shaped by method, expectation, and memory. The Anunnaki stand within that stable center, unchanged by the readings they generate. This continuity marks the end of transmission from antiquity to the present. Clay tablets remain. Questions remain. Interpretation continues without final resolution. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It really helps the channel. Subscribe if you want more slow, detailed documentaries like this one. You can also leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.